Greetings everyone, I hope you're well. I've had several people write to me this week asking, how did Annabelle come to have generalized anxiety disorder, a mental condition that is characterized by excessive or unrealistic anxiety over two or more aspects of daily life. Now, most people believe that her condition was caused by abuse, and I have to agree, but only if you can imagine abuse occurring outside of physical torture. Annabelle's condition is more than likely the abuse of her genetics. Now let me explain. Evolution, quite simply, favors those organisms or those animals that can stay alive long enough to reproduce. It is simple as that. When the environment changes, then the genes within those animals that are passed forward in successive generations will mutate to try and stay alive. And those that do it the best, that's who nature wants to reproduce. Long time ago, the wolf was on that evolutionary trajectory, taking this little journey in a step-by-step process that took hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years in the making. And then along came mankind and stuck his fingers right in the good old evolutionary pie. And we caused what's known in evolution as a large leap. And that's not going to happen unless it's done with artificial selection, not natural selection. In natural selection, everything moves in micro levels, step by step by step. Again, over thousands of years, minor successes in mutations in genes lead to more successive mutations in genes. But again, we came along and in 60,000 years, we managed to produce an animal like Annabelle that is afraid of unfamiliar people, even though they're not acting threateningly, afraid of vehicles, even though she's never been hit by a vehicle, afraid of being left alone, even though you have been left alone and you didn't die as a result of it. We created animals that have upside down brains like the pug. And worse yet, if we humans were to suddenly just disappear right now off the face of the earth, immediately within the first year, or the first generation, all bulldogs would become extinct because they have to be born through a C-section. Their heads are too broad to naturally pass through the birth canal. So without our help, every bulldog would become extinct within one generation. And then the tiny little dogs like a Chihuahua or a Yorkie, or like two of our dogs, Morkies, little Maltese Yorkie mixes, they would disappear within the first year because they would find themselves on the other end of the predatory-prey spectrum. They would go from predator to prey. In other words, they'd probably become lunch or dinner. And then those large animals that you think would do very well, like a Newfoundland or a Mastiff or a St. Bernard, no, they won't survive either. They'll be gone within 2 to 3 years because their organs are too small for their bodies, and we did that. So without our extra care, they're going to disappear. And what you're going to be left with after this Hunger Games type apocalyptic scenario would be more than likely some version of the husky, the Akita, the Spitz, animals that are naturally aggressive but are not too large and have too small of organs, animals that can run fast, that can defend territories, that can successfully battle other dogs in the competition to have a mate and then produce offspring and provide for the offspring and protect the offspring. That's more than likely what we'd have left. In other words, only a few of the breeds would end up going back to being a wolf. Now, today's wolf hasn't been affected by artificial selection by mankind. They've been on their natural evolutionary journey. And as a result, without mankind muddling in their genetic pie, they are now one of the most prolific hunters on the face of the earth. They can survive under almost impossible conditions. But again, we stepped in and interfered, and we created animals that simply cannot survive without our help. Okay, now let's take this a little bit further. Even though we changed animals from an anatomical standpoint, again, upside down brains, reset faces where animals can't breathe very well, what the last thing to change is not from a physical standpoint, because again, that really didn't matter if you have an upside down brain. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you shelter, food, everything that you need to stay alive, especially stay alive long enough to reproduce. In fact, I may force you to reproduce because I'm a breeder. But the last things to change, even through the great leap that we caused through artificial selection, are the behavioral makeup of the animal. Phenotypic, how the genes affect that animal's behavior. In other words, all the behavioral traits that help me to stave off death and would help me to reproduce, those stay around the longest. And part of those behaviors is aggression. An agonism holds societies together. So whether it be instigative aggression, any type of aggression, attack another animal, defend your mate from another animal, acquire a mate by defeating another animal, those genes stay around. So we have some dogs that do attack people and harm people. We also kept the genes that allow you to say, I don't want to make contact with you. Contact is risky. That could get me hurt. So kind of let me show you my stuff. Let me throw my chest out here. Let me show you my teeth, raise my hackles, put up my tail, stand taunt, and hopefully that'll make you just back off or go away. But then there's another option. It's called flee. Yeah, just leave, run, live to fight another day. So all of those genetic behavioral characteristics have stayed intact in all dogs. However, in some dogs, you have more dominant type genes. And in Annabelle's case, obviously somewhere in her near ancestral line, whether it was her mother's mother, or her mother's mother's mother, one of those, they had genes in their body, fear genes, that overwhelmed and dominated some of the other genes. And again, how does this happen? Because we help it happen. We allow it to happen. Even if it happens by accident, even we believe that Annabelle was running stray when she became impregnated, there's zero chance that she would have lived long enough on her own or in the wild if mankind disappeared off this planet long enough to be able to meet a mate and then to be able to reproduce. And even if she does, it's not going to continue to happen in successive generations. Producers produce. They produce mates. They produce territories. They produce offspring. They're big, bad, bold. They give ulcers. They don't get ulcers. There's a reason for this, because nature, again, through natural selection, favors those genes. So as a result, Annabelle more than likely had genes in her that are predisposed to being fearful under particular circumstances. When a large vehicle is approaching me, when unfamiliar people are approaching me, when I'm left by myself, or when there's a thunderstorm. It's okay to be a little fearful of all of these. You're right. You don't want to be hit by trucks, struck by lightning, and you don't want some unfamiliar person to try and hurt you. But there's also an adjustment. These are super hyper social animals, both the wolf and the dog. And with enough exposure to their surrounding areas, then learning should take place. You should learn that if I do X, Y, and Z from a strategy standpoint, I won't get hit by a truck, I won't get beat up by a human, and thunderstorms aren't going to kill me. But when you have genes that dominate and overwhelm the animal, like Annabelle has, then she literally gets in her own way. Those genes don't really help her. They kind of harm her. Other animals, like Captain, he's been exposed to thunderstorms, a whole bunch of unfamiliar people, especially when he was only a year old, and I was on my Embracing the Wild in Your Dog book tour all over the United States. He went on TV sets, radio shows, you name it, New York City, Chicago, Miami, it's all these big cities. There's Captain. And he did fine. You can go watch him yourself. Because his genetics are not overwhelmed. They're not dominated, even though this is an option, it's a Bible option. It doesn't dominate me. I have some people that are afraid of tight spaces. They're severely claustrophobic. Why are you claustrophobic, I ask? Did you ever get stuck in a freezer when you're playing hide and go seek as a kid? And they answer, no. There's no direct experience to justify why they're afraid to be in a tight space. Same thing with people afraid of heights. Why are you afraid of heights? Did you fall out of a tree? No. Because they have genes that are predisposed to that because those were passed down. When I was a kid, we used to say the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Now we say that darn thing rubbed bark all the way down. So there's no way an animal can become as fearful, multi-dimensional fearful of everything. Unfamiliar people, vehicles, thunderstorms, being left by myself. In other words, remember, 2 or more aspects of daily life. You have excessive or unrealistic anxiety over that. You don't become like that as a dog unless you were genetically predisposed to become that way. So as a result, Annabelle does suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, mostly from her genetics. A lot of studies are now being conducted on GADs in humans. What is the cause? We humans, we believe, can actually create generalized anxiety in ourselves because we've lived long enough and we're smart enough to mobilize our stress response from a mere thought. Yeah. Towards your dog, it has to have the truck, the thunderstorm, you have to be absent. In Annabelle's case, to be fearful. She can't sit there in her kennel right now and think, oh goodness, Bryan's going to take me on a walk this afternoon and we're probably going to encounter a whole bunch of those big, nasty, loud-sounding vehicles. No, she's not thinking about that. But see, we can. We can go, oh Lord, I have to go to the dentist tomorrow. And next thing you know, your whole body's in an uproar. So guys, if Annabelle was abused, that chain of events happened thousands of years ago. And recently, the environment may have given her a reason, pressure from the environment, to be the way she is. Especially if she was not exposed to relevant stimuli during that time period in her life, from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, when she has more brain cells than she'll ever have that are primed to seek out that particular stimuli and learn from it. So if I was never exposed to it, I never learned from it. And because I didn't learn from it, all those brain cells atrophy. They're gone. And you'll be playing catch up for the rest of that dog's life. So again, now you had a weak animal that should never, ever, that was born from an animal who was probably born from another animal who should have never reproduced, who natural selection would have never allowed to reproduce, or even if it did, you wouldn't have any grandkids. They wouldn't be around long enough for them to successfully reproduce. And that's how we get there. So Annabelle's condition is the result mostly of nature. And no doubt a contributory factor is nurture. But right now it's a capital N, nature, more so than nurture. All right, I hope you learned something from this. I'll be having more videos and more chalk talks regarding Annabelle's condition. I will talk probably in one of my upcoming videos about medications, why we choose to use the medications that we use, and again, specifically in a chalk talk, how do they work? You'd be surprised how many people, even though it's claimed now that 8 in 10 people on the planet Earth are taking an antidepressant. I've talked to hundreds of these people, and they don't even know how an antidepressant works. Just out of blind faith, they just take the pill or a couple times a day or once a day, and they just do it. So I'm going to teach you a little bit more about how they work and why I use them and when do I use them, so that you understand that if you have a dog that could be suffering from something like Annabelle or just one type of phobia, I'm going to help you solve this problem. And we don't use the word cure in this thing, guys, because again, this is genetic. I'm never going to cure Annabelle. I'm just going to increase her quality of life. She won't be as fearful when I'm finished. She will have some life that has a great deal more joy and more confidence and less fear in it than she currently does. So stay tuned for those future videos. Until then, be safe.